Margret was always a woman of routine. Her life up until that moment had followed a clear and predictable path. Waking up early, donning her scrubs, and stepping into the busy world of the hospital, she was a nurse, and for years, that was all she knew. But on this particular day, as she clocked in, she had no idea that her world was about to be turned upside down. The usual chaos of the hospital hallway buzzed in her ears as she settled into her shift. Her mind focused on the tasks ahead, checking vitals, administering medications, and offering comfort to patients. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary at first. That was until the emergency doors burst open with a rush of air, signaling the arrival of a critically injured patient. A stretcher was wheeled in and paramedics shouted to the medical staff, urgently conveying vital statistics, gunshot wounds, multiple entry points. The words rang out with such precision that the team knew they were about to face a life-or-death situation. The atmosphere in the emergency room shifted immediately, and a tense silence enveloped the space. Margaret's pulse quickened as she observed the scene before her. The man lying on the gurney, his white shirt soaked in blood, looked nothing short of lifeless. His face was pale, his breathing shallow, and his body seemed to fight for every breath, every heartbeat. She instinctively moved forward to help, her training kicking in, but her efforts were halted by a voice that cut through the room like a cold gust of wind. "No police clearance, no treatment," the hospital manager declared, his voice stern and uncompromising. He stood with his arms crossed, his expression devoid of empathy, as though this was merely another bureaucratic decision he had to make. Margaret's heart sank. How could this be happening? She glanced around the room, hoping someone would challenge the manager's directive, but to her dismay, the staff hesitated. Some lowered their eyes, others stepped back. The room was full of fear, uncertainty, and a quiet acceptance of the manager's words. No one dared to oppose him. The beeping of the heart monitor grew erratic as the patient continued to lose blood. Every second that passed brought the man closer to death, but the hospital's rules stood firm. Margaret's hands trembled at her sides as a battle raged within her. She had taken an oath to save lives, to act in the best interest of the patient, but this situation was different. She knew the consequences of breaking protocol. It would cost her. It could cost her job, her career, and her reputation. But as she looked at the man in front of her, she realized she couldn't just stand there, not when his life hung in the balance. Margret steeled herself, disregarding the rule that held her back. She grabbed a pair of gloves and without a word, moved to grab the medical supplies. The room fell silent. The only sound was the beeping of the heart monitor, which seemed to grow louder with each passing moment. With every movement, every second that ticked by, the tension in the ER grew heavier. Margret worked swiftly, her hands steady as she stabilized the man's airway and applied pressure to stop the bleeding. The smell of antiseptic filled her nostrils, grounding her in the task at hand. She stitched the wounds, administered fluids, and monitored his vitals, her focus narrowing to the patient in front of her. Time felt like it had slowed down, and in that moment it was just her and him. The beeping of the monitor began to steady. The man's vitals were stabilizing. He was alive. A quiet sigh of relief spread through the room, but it was short-lived. A slow, deliberate clap broke the silence. Margret looked up to find the manager standing in the doorway, his cold expression still unchanged. "Well done, Nurse Margret. You saved him. But you no longer work here," he said, his words like a knife through her chest. The weight of his statement sank into her bones, and the sterile walls of the ER seemed to close in on her. The place she had dedicated her life to, the place that had been her second home for years, had just cast her aside as though she were expendable. No one spoke. No one came to her defense. Her colleagues, who had watched her defy orders to save a life, averted their gazes. Her heart ached with the sting of betrayal, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she stood tall, removed her hospital badge from her scrubs, and placed it on the counter. She walked out, leaving behind a career she had built, not knowing what the future would hold, but determined to stand by the choice she had made. As she walked through the city streets, Margret felt the weight of her decision press down on her. She had given everything for the man she had saved, only to lose everything in return. She didn't know what to do next. Her future was uncertain. The harsh sunlight cast long shadows across the pavement, but she barely noticed as she walked aimlessly, her mind still reeling. She absent-mindedly touched the hospital ID tucked into her pocket, the only thing she had left from her old life. She hadn't been able to bring herself to throw it away yet. Perhaps deep down, part of her wasn't ready to let go. It was then that her thoughts were interrupted by a loud commotion ahead, a gasp, a thud, and then a cry of alarm. Margaret's eyes darted toward the scene unfolding in a nearby park. A crowd had gathered, their faces frozen in shock. She could feel the pull of urgency drawing her in, her instincts as a nurse kicking in once more. Pushing through the onlookers, she saw an elderly man clutching his chest, his face pale as he stumbled and collapsed to the ground. It was cardiac arrest. Without hesitation, Margret dropped to her knees beside him. "Someone call an ambulance!" she shouted, already checking for a pulse. Nothing. Time slowed. She felt her heart race, but there was no panic, just the familiar calm that came with doing what she knew best. Lacing her fingers together, she placed her hands on the man's chest and began chest compressions. The pressure was forceful, sending shockwaves through her arms as she counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, each compression bringing her closer to saving this man's life. The murmurs of the crowd faded into the background, but the sound of her hands striking his chest was loud in her ears. She was fully focused, determined to bring him back. After 30 compressions, she leaned down, pinched his nose, and gave him 2 breaths. His chest rose and fell with each breath, and she continued, pressing on, not giving up. Then, a sudden gasp. The man's body jerked, and his eyelids fluttered open. The crowd exhaled in relief, and Margret could barely contain the joy that flooded her. He was alive. The paramedics arrived soon after, taking over the situation as Margret stood back, her hands shaking with adrenaline. She had done it. She had saved a life. A voice interrupted her thoughts. A man in an expensive suit, his expression a mixture of relief and awe, approached her. It was the personal assistant of the elderly man who had been watching helplessly from the sidelines. "Miss," he began, his voice shaky, "you saved his life. Please, may I have your contact information, just in case Mr. Combs needs anything?" Margret hesitated. The name Combs rang a bell, but she couldn't place it. She had just been in the moment, focused on saving the man in front of her. She reached into her pocket, pulling out the hospital ID and handed it over. "Here," she said simply. The assistant nodded, clearly grateful, and made a mental note of her information before stepping back as the paramedics took the elderly man away. The crowd lingered for a while, but Margret didn't stick around. She had done her part, and now it was time to move on. The whispers of the crowd, the stares, the curiosity, it was all part of a reality she didn't want to be part of anymore. She had to leave, to find some peace. Margret didn't realize it then, but the moment she had just experienced would change her life forever. Later that evening, as she sat in her small apartment, the weight of the day continued to press on her shoulders. No job, no security, no clear future, just a choice that had cost her everything. Her tiny living space felt even more claustrophobic as the dim light from her lamp flickered. Then she heard it. The distant rumble of engines. The sound grew louder, deeper, and more powerful. It wasn't the typical noise of her quiet neighborhood. Curiosity piqued, Margret walked to the window and peeked outside. What she saw left her speechless. A line of sleek black luxury cars, their polished exteriors gleaming under the streetlights, lined the street in front of her apartment. These weren't just any cars. They were the kind of vehicles you saw in the movies, owned by CEOs, celebrities, or people with immense power. Margret wasn't the only one who noticed. Shadows flickered behind the windows of the neighboring buildings, and curious faces peeked out, watching the strange procession. Then there was a knock at the door, a firm, steady knock that made her heart race. The knock repeated, confident and unhurried. Margret stood frozen for a moment, gripping the doorknob with trembling fingers. Should she open it? Who would be knocking at her door? The cars outside were a mystery, and now, this sudden knock. Taking a deep breath, she turned the knob, unsure of what she would face. Standing in the doorway was Isaac Combs, the very man she had saved just hours ago. Margaret's mind raced. The man who had been on the brink of death was now standing before her, alive and commanding. Behind him stood his assistant holding a large envelope. Isaac's smile was knowing, his presence powerful. "Margret," he said, his voice calm and assured, "we need to talk." The days following that fateful dinner were a blur for Margret. Her mind was clouded with thoughts of what Isaac had offered her, a life she had never dreamed of, a chance to build something from the ground up. Yet there was hesitation, an inner tug-of-war between the path she had known and the path now laid out before her. It wasn't just the $500,000, though the offer had been jaw-dropping. It was the life that Isaac had promised her, a life where bureaucracy didn't stand in the way of helping people, a life that seemed too good to be true. She sat in her small apartment late one evening, the same apartment where just days ago she had felt utterly defeated. The check was still on the table, a reminder of what she could have if she took the leap. But with it came a weight, a decision that she knew could change everything. Isaac's words echoed in her mind. "I'm offering you a purpose." The thought was almost too overwhelming to process. Her entire career had been about helping people, about making sure those in need received care, no matter what. Now, here she was, standing at a crossroads where she had to choose between safety and a new life, full of uncertainties and unimaginable potential. Her phone buzzed on the table, dragging her from her thoughts. The caller ID displayed Isaac's name. She had expected this moment to come, but it still caught her off guard. She inhaled deeply before answering. "Hello, Isaac?" "Margret." His voice was calm, but there was an underlying urgency. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation last night. I want you to know that I'm not just offering you a position. This is an opportunity for you to change lives, including your own. I need someone who understands the value of human life, someone who won't be swayed by politics or profit margins. This isn't just another job, it's a chance to be part of something bigger." Margret felt the weight of his words as if he had just placed a heavy mantle on her shoulders. She had known she was being given a gift, but she hadn't realized the extent of what it meant to him. She wasn't just filling a position, she was becoming part of his mission. She bit her lip, her mind racing. "I don't know, Isaac. It's a huge change. I've built my whole life around being a nurse. What if I fail? What if everything I've worked for is just gone in an instant?" Isaac's voice softened, and she could almost picture him leaning back in his chair, hands folded, giving her the time to think. "Margret, you've already shown that you're willing to risk it all for something you believe in. You didn't hesitate when you saved that man in the park. You didn't let anything stand in your way. That's the spirit I need. I won't ask you to leave your past behind completely, but I am asking you to step forward, to take a chance on something that could change the world." His words resonated deeply within her. She hadn't thought about it that way before. Her decision to step into the unknown hadn't been about proving herself. It had been about doing what she knew was right, no matter the cost. And now, standing at the precipice of a new life, she realized that Isaac was offering her a chance to continue down that path. She wasn't being asked to change who she was. She was being asked to amplify what she already stood for. A hospital where lives came first, where rules didn't hinder care, a place that she could help build from scratch. "Okay," she finally whispered, her voice firm with determination. "I'm in. I'll take the chance." Isaac didn't hesitate. "Good, I knew you would. Meet me tomorrow at 10 o'clock. I'll arrange everything." As Margret hung up, she felt a sense of calm wash over her. For the first time in days, she didn't feel lost. She felt like she was moving towards something meaningful, something she could be proud of. The next morning, Margret stood in front of the gleaming hospital building Isaac had shown her the day before. The doors were wide open, beckoning her inside, and for the first time, she didn't feel nervous or overwhelmed. She felt ready. Isaac's words had cemented her resolve. This was her opportunity, her moment to take everything she had learned and make a real impact. Walking through the doors, she was immediately struck by the atmosphere. It was bright, clean, and inviting. There was none of the cold, impersonal sterility that she had grown accustomed to in the hospital where she had worked. Here, everything seemed to breathe with life. Doctors and nurses moved efficiently, their eyes focused on the task at hand, but they weren't rushing. There was no sense of panic, just calm determination. She took a deep breath and walked further in, her heart swelling with a sense of belonging. Isaac greeted her at the front desk, his usual poised demeanor, but now there was a spark in his eyes, a sign that he was watching her, waiting to see how she would respond to this new world. "I wanted you to see this before we start," he said, gesturing to the open space before them. "This is what we're building here, a place where we can heal without barriers, a hospital where every single person is treated with the utmost care. No more waiting for approvals, no more red tape, just medicine, just people." Margret nodded, her gaze sweeping over the space. It was everything she had ever wanted in a hospital, a place where she could truly make a difference. And now, she had the power to do it. This was her new beginning. The first few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Margret was involved in every step of the process, designing patient care programs, assembling a team of like-minded doctors and nurses, making sure that the foundation they built was solid. But it wasn't just about structure and organization. It was about creating a culture, a spirit of compassion that would permeate every corner of the hospital. Isaac's vision was clear, and Margret was determined to see it through. She worked late into the evenings, crafting policies that focused on patient care above all else. She chose every team member carefully, making sure that they shared her vision and commitment to the cause. There were no compromises. Every decision was made with the intention of improving the lives of those who walked through the doors of the hospital, and it paid off. The first few patients who arrived at the hospital were treated with the care and attention they deserved. Word began to spread quickly, and soon more people were seeking out the hospital. People who had been turned away from other facilities due to their inability to pay or the complexity of their conditions found a place where they were treated like human beings. Margret stood in the lobby one afternoon, watching as patients were escorted to their rooms by smiling nurses. She felt a sense of peace wash over her. This was why she had made the decision to step into the unknown. This was why she had chosen to risk everything. Behind her, Isaac walked up, his presence calm and reassuring as always. "How are you feeling about everything?" he asked. Margret turned to him, her heart full. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Isaac nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I knew you were the right choice from the moment I saw you save that man in the park. You have the heart of a healer, Margret. This place, this hospital, wouldn't be what it is without you." Margret's eyes welled up with tears. It had been a long road to get here, a road filled with sacrifices and doubts. But now, standing in the place she had helped build, she knew she had made the right decision. Isaac looked at her with a knowing smile. "You're not just running a hospital, Margret. You're changing the world, one life at a time." Margret's heart swelled. She had started this journey as a simple nurse, someone who had been fired for doing the right thing. But now, She was more than that. She was a part of something bigger than herself, something that would change lives, something that would make a difference in ways she had never imagined. And as she looked around at the hospital she had helped create, she knew that this was only the beginning. There were many more lives to save, many more people to help. The work had only just begun. Months passed, and Margaret's life took on a rhythm that was both challenging and fulfilling. The hospital, now fully operational, had become a beacon of hope for those who had long been overlooked. Every day new patients arrived, and with each one, Margret felt the weight of their trust, a trust that she, Isaac, and the entire team had worked so hard to earn. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Challenges arose, as they always did. The media began to take notice of the hospital's rapid success, and not all of it was positive. There were whispers among local authorities and healthcare organizations, questioning the hospital's unconventional approach. Some even accused Isaac of trying to undermine the established healthcare system, while others feared the impact his hospital would have on the competitive healthcare market. One afternoon, while reviewing patient records in her office, Margret received a phone call. It was from a well-known reporter who wanted an exclusive interview with Isaac. She knew the media had been circling for weeks, eager to know more about the enigmatic founder of the hospital, but she hadn't anticipated this. "Margret," Isaac's voice came through the line, calm and unshaken. "We need to talk." She leaned back in her chair. "About the interview?" "Yes, I want to make sure we're on the same page before I sit down with them. They're going to ask about our methods, our funding, and our long-term goals. I need you to be prepared for what's coming." Margret felt a knot form in her stomach. Isaac's vision had always been bold, but now it was being scrutinized. The pressure was mounting, and she could feel it in her bones. She had always been a healer, a caregiver, but now she was being thrust into a new role. She wasn't just running a hospital. She was a spokesperson for a revolution in healthcare. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady, though her heart was racing. "But I don't think the world is ready for what we're doing here, Isaac." Isaac chuckled softly. "The world never is. But that's why we're here, to show them what's possible. Trust in the work we've done. It speaks for itself." The night of the interview arrived, and the tension in the air was palpable. Isaac sat across from the reporter, his usual calm demeanor unwavering. Margret stood by his side, offering support, but her nerves were still frayed. She knew the questions were going to be tough. The reporter, a sharp and seasoned journalist, wasted no time. "Mr. McAllister," the reporter began, "your hospital has been called a disruption to the established healthcare system. Some critics argue that your methods are unsustainable and that you're focusing more on ideals than on real-world practicality. How do you respond to that?" Isaac leaned forward slightly, his eyes intense. "Our hospital is built on the belief that people should come first. When someone is sick, they don't need red tape or bureaucracy. They need care, and they need it now. We found a way to make that happen without compromising the quality of care." The reporter raised an eyebrow. "But critics are questioning your funding. How do you continue to provide free care to those who need it? Are you concerned about the long-term viability of this model?" Margret held her breath, but Isaac answered without hesitation. "Our funding comes from people who believe in what we're doing, people who see the value of compassionate care. We have investors who are committed to the mission, and we also generate income through our private practices. We're not relying on government grants or insurance companies. Our model is sustainable because it's built on integrity." The reporter turned to Margret, clearly hoping to catch her off guard. "And you, Ms. Lawson? What do you think about the criticism? You've been instrumental in shaping this hospital. Do you think this model is the future of healthcare, or is it an unsustainable dream?" Margret took a deep breath, her nerves giving way to a quiet confidence. I think what we're doing here is more than just a hospital. It's a movement. It's about putting people's needs first and not allowing profit margins to dictate the kind of care they receive. It's about treating people like human beings, not numbers on a chart. This hospital isn't just a place to get treatment. It's a place to feel seen, heard, and cared for. Her words seemed to hang in the air for a moment, the reporter looking at her as if she had just said something that defied the logic he had come to expect. But after a long pause, he nodded, scribbling something down in his notes. The interview continued, but the tension in the room had shifted. Isaac had set the tone, and Margret had sealed their commitment to the cause with her conviction. The world might not be ready for what they were doing, but they were ready to change it, one life at a time. The next few weeks brought a surge of support. People who had once been skeptical began to see the hospital's success as proof that the system could be changed. The media coverage was a mixed bag. Some outlets hailed Isaac and Margret as visionaries, while others tried to tear them down. But through it all, the patients remained the focus. The hospital continued to grow, and so did the team. Doctors, nurses, and staff who shared the same values came from all over the country, eager to be part of something greater than themselves. Margret found herself standing in the lobby again one afternoon, watching as patients were treated with care and dignity. She could hardly believe how far they had come. She was no longer just a nurse. She was part of a movement, a force that was changing the way people saw healthcare. Isaac joined her, his presence always steady, a quiet reminder of the vision they had built together. "You did good, Margret," he said softly, looking out over the bustling lobby. "This is just the beginning." Margret smiled, her heart full. "I know, there's so much more to do." And as she looked around at the faces of the patients, the staff, and the families that filled the hospital, she knew that this was the life she had always dreamed of. It wasn't just about saving lives. It was about changing the world,